The struggles of getting a new film franchise off the ground in today's cinema landscape are, at this point, overly documented. From the stillbirth of Universal's Dark Universe to the slow death of the original DC Extended Universe, one doesn't have to dig deep to find the shattered corporate dreams of box office gold in a well of audience apathy. However, today, we are not discussing the wins and woes of beginning a new cinematic universe, but instead the related and yet separate struggle of breathing new life into a franchise that is in decline. We will do this through a comparison of this summer's twin superhero blockbusters, Superman and the Fantastic Four: First Steps. For a bit of brief background, Superman comes as the beginning of a new cinematic universe of DC Comics superheroes, governed chiefly by renowned director James Gunn, with the original attempt at such a universe having been mainly led by the vision of Zack Snyder, and having dwindled over 11 years from controversial yet successful blockbusters to a barrage of box office bombs. Its twin, the Fantastic Four, comes from a similar corporate environment, being an attempt to regain popular interest in the slowly fading Marvel Cinematic Universe, which once achieved multiple billion-dollar hits in one year, but has since fallen into disrepute after an onslaught of creative misfires. Fantastic Four itself being something of an appetizer to get people interested in next year's Avengers Doomsday, a film which seems to star everyone on the planet. So the parallels here are clear to see. Both films are a final attempt to squeeze profitability out of recognizable characters by attracting interest to the future of a disreputable franchise. What I specifically want to discuss here is the wide gap between each film's reception, with Superman garnering success, acclaim, and shocking levels of general audience appreciation, while Fantastic Four, even accounting for it being far newer by time of writing, has so far received a more muted, if not outright nonplussed response. Why is that? Warning, spoilers ahead. The way I see it, there are three primary factors that will affect the general response to these films in the moment of their release. The first is what I'll call audience recognition, and it's a simple equation that no doubt corporate stooges at DC and Marvel have worked out many a time. Put simply, people know and like Superman. Practically every generation of the last half century has grown up with some form of live-action Superman representation on the big or small screen, from Christopher Reeve's 1978 classic all the way to 2013's Man of Steel. A general audience knows Superman. The new film even acknowledges this by choosing to forego the typical origin story one might associate with these films and instead begin in media res, with Superman being laid low in his first major loss. This choice tells us as much about the audience as it does the filmmakers. From this choice we understand in no uncertain terms that most people have some understanding of who Superman is, or are expected to, whether they simply know him as the guy in red underpants who flies around saving people, or if they happen to be comic-loving degenerates like myself, who have pored over his origin story as a drifting space baby dozens of times. On the other hand, most people's understanding of the Fantastic Four will start and end at The Incredibles, this film marking the third attempt at a Fantastic Four franchise in 20 years. Interestingly, where Superman weaves his origin into the central conflict by tying the character's sense of self to his understanding of home and family, the Fantastic Four, which initially seems to skip the origin of its characters, then spends much of its first act reminding you what that origin is, from flashbacks to the ill-fated space voyage that gave them their powers, to repeated mentions of the cosmic radiation that changed them, just to serve as extra reminders. Just like Superman, this choice tells you what expectations are placed on the audience, the question at hand being, does this repeated exposition show a lack of faith in the audience's ability to care enough about these characters to retain simple information for the duration of a 2-hour movie, or is it simply a clunky way of delivering information? Superman is an instantly recognizable symbol all over the world, one that DC wants to remind you represents hope, while the Fantastic Four are a team with an unsure place in our media landscape. with Marvel clearly wanting to pay heavy homage to the team's comic book roots, most blatantly by setting this film in an alternate retro-futurist universe taking influence from 60s sci-fi, but at the same time wanting to reject previous failed attempts at a film adaptation of the characters. But at the same time as that, not wanting to reject that so much that they cannot later wheel out Chris Evans as the Human Torch, should they desire a quick cash injection. The second of the three factors I would like to discuss is tone. Superman is, despite its structural faults, a tonally consistent and thematically assured film. The film cares deeply about Clark Kent both as Superman and as a man, using the tale of Kal-El discovering his true origin as a vehicle through which to establish its message of hope. Superman was sent to do evil, but his humanity allows him to reject that and to choose to do good, even when the world turns against him. Superman wants to engage with its main character both from the perspective of what he means as a symbol and how easily that can change, as well as what he feels and chooses to do as a person. This tone and these themes are expressed simply in the scene where Clark allows Lois to interview him, where it becomes clear that Clark doesn't see the world through the murky lens of politics or nations, but rather from the position of the ultimate humanitarian, someone who is not only willing to, but feels obligated to try and stand against the deaths of all innocents, his final enemy being the far too recognizable archetype of a petty, vindictive, and insecure billionaire. The Fantastic Four also wants to be a story about hope. It is a story where a major plot beat involves all of the world's governments uniting in one task to try and save the planet. In today's climate, a story about an illegal alien standing against a corrupt country's invasion backed by American billionaires is not even necessarily metaphor so much as it is just a literal mirror held up to current world politics. In this way, Superman is a film that could not be more perfectly designed for the exact cultural moment we find ourselves in. A moment where people's assumptions of the countries they came from, messages of freedom and democracy, are being openly revealed to instead be rallying cries for imperialism and ethno-nationalism. Conversely, the Fantastic Four's hopeful themes are confined to the concept of all governments working together to save the planet, a retro-idealistic concept unthinkable in 2025, and the hope that the titular four find in their defense of the nuclear family, nuclear both in structure and in the radiation that created them all, literally going as far as to resurrect the mother, Sue, during the climax to maintain the family structure. As a result, Fantastic Four is a muddled film that not only fails to instill the same sense of hopefulness as Superman, but that also takes such a retro approach to conveying that hope that it ultimately provides nothing particularly emotionally resonant through its themes to a modern audience. The final factor I consider a primary concern in understanding the differing reactions between these films is very simply their execution as directorial works. Anyone who has seen both a Guardians of the Galaxy film and 2025's Superman instinctually can tell that there is a shared creative direction behind both pieces. James Gunn's distinct audio and visual design comes through clearly in his works, even under studio conditions, and it allows for all of his works to feel like related pieces of art, even when they suffer from such structural issues as Superman does. We can argue all the livelong day about whether or not James Gunn's style is good for these movies, but what I think we have to agree on is that his style is fundamentally more interesting than if these movies had had their director's unique flourishes sanded off, as so many MCU films do. Infamously, Nia DaCosta described her experience directing The Marvels as a Kevin Feige production. It's his movie. And this is just one of thousands of examples of studio interference in Marvel movies attempting to make sure that they all resemble the style, if you could call it that, established by Joss Whedon with the Avengers and later refined by the Russos for their works. The Marvel machine wants to churn these movies out identically because the formula has made them billions. The Fantastic Four is just another film made in this image. I know that the Fantastic Four and Captain America 4 were directed by different people, but if I wasn't a movie buff, if I didn't have access to Letterboxd, I don't think that fact would be obvious to me at any point, like it would be if you showed someone the Guardians of the Galaxy movies and then the Black Panther movies. Examples of films where directorial style and authorial intent were able to bleed through the studio machine. The Fantastic Four then suffers from the same homogenization as the vast majority of MCU films after Joss Whedon's Avengers. Not a passion project driven by the love or drive of a creative, but instead sanitized corporate products assembled by committee. Committees that would see their audiences become like Galactus, not choosing what to consume, but just endlessly consuming. While Gunn's Superman bears his hallmarks from the iconic needle drops to the vibrant color palette, even to the somewhat filtered, sardonic outlook that his works tend to take, the Fantastic Four is functional. Its direction is entirely competent, but completely anonymous. It is not a Matt Shakman film, but a Marvel Studios production, a sterilized and inoffensive piece of content designed to fit neatly into the ever-expanding and exhaustingly large Marvel Cinematic Universe. This difference is, I believe, most key to understanding why Gunn's Superman has resonated more deeply with audiences than Shakman's Fantastic Four. Hell, my first point was about audience recognition, a point that makes sense in a directorial vacuum like the one that Marvel creates, but falls apart when applied to examples of films about lesser known characters made by directors allowed to create heartfelt works. Who the hell knew who Star-Lord was before Guardians of the Galaxy? Nobody. But word of mouth about that energetic, colorful, 80s inspired space adventure turned it not only into a hit, but a cornerstone of the MCU's larger narrative. Where Superman uses a fight between Clark and a literal violent and brainless clone of himself to visualize Clark overcoming his supposed genocidal purpose, the Fantastic Four resorts to the big CGI fight in its third act that is by now not only typical of Marvel movies, but a well-recognized flaw. A flaw that is not an accident, but a symptom of the formulaic way these films are being made, and in a media landscape teeming with talk of superhero fatigue, a functional but uninspired work like Fantastic Four is simply not enough to drive audience interest, especially when released 2 weeks out from something as singular as Superman. And Marvel must know this. This is an anecdote, but personally, I have never seen as much casual audience interest in a recent Marvel movie as I did with Thunderbolts, their immediate last release, which, like I said about Guardians of the Galaxy, had a distinct creative vision that inspired word of mouth to turn a movie about a group of characters very few people even remembered existed into a critical and commercial success. And when you put all of this into context, it is kind of hard to deny that while Fantastic Four seeks to achieve something new by doing everything the same, Superman launches its new universe with a bold, striking, and most importantly, distinct experience that surpasses its flaws to create a cultural moment. And really, releasing next to that, the Fantastic Four never stood a chance. And that's kind of it. As someone deeply interested in film, television, gaming, etc., I always find myself inspired to discuss what makes something like Superman a hit and what makes something like Fantastic Four a miss. And I'd like to thank you for listening to my thoughts on the matter. If you have thoughts of your own, you probably know where to leave them. And if you want to see me ramble about more nonsense, there are buttons you can press to convey such a thing. There's one that's shaped like a thumb. Make sure to hit the one that's going up, not down. That would be real bad. And then there's one that says subscribe, which if you really want to, but you don't have to. But yeah, so I suppose without further ado, I will see you next time, and thank you again for watching.